Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about the Daemon Prince in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, also known as the worst legendary lord in the game, Daniel or Yuri, whichever name you wish to go by. So what makes the Daemon Prince so bad? Well, to be very clear, he was probably the worst legendary lord even in Realms of Chaos, either that or Kugath, but he certainly had a lot of issues. So let's talk about the issues that he does have in Immortal Empires, how he falls short compared to virtually every single other legendary lord. In fact, he is so bad that I deliberately didn't include him in a lot of the tier lists because he would have been bottom tier in every single one of them. He is completely broken. But how is he broken? Well, there's a couple of factors. First off, let's talk about the Daemon Prince as a character. You don't have item slots. Instead, you have this bullshit body part system. But the problem with the body part system is it's supposed to make up for the fact you can't put items and you don't have an item set, you don't have quest items. The issue here, however, is it really doesn't in quite a few significant ways. I mean, there is certainly power to be gained here, and there are certainly item sets that can be useful. For instance, like getting all glory from all sources, or getting a Sinnelleos set that gives me 10 diplomatic relations with all factions. But in terms of combat power, you might be surprised, but someone with an Armor of Destiny, a good weapon, and a Talisman of Preservation might actually end up being substantially better than the Daemon Prince, with all of these body parts that he can get access to. There are some good ones, and I'm sure you can make a good set, but it's quite a hassle to do so. And a Daemon Prince that the Warriors of Chaos can make, like Archaon, Bellicor, doesn't matter. Either an undivided one or a dedicated one can actually end up being better in battle. Then there's the skill line. It is a gigantic mess. Beyond the fact that you have to spend 1 point just to get a bit of glory, and you don't want to spend more points because you've got other things to deal with. The way it's set up is a gigantic mess. There are useful things, but they're so spread out that ends up being a gigantic clusterfuck to try and sort things out and actually end up with some useful skills. My advice, if you're going to play the Daemon Prince, one of the most important ones is getting Respect of the North, so you get plus 30 diplomatic relations with warriors, demons, and beastmen, which is useful, and of course get Root Marcher with a point of control for there, and then you can go with Friends of the Cave for minus 50% upkeep for Nurgle. After that, you may want to get Destroyer, and I probably should have gone full on for Destroyer for that income from sacking settlements. So I'll talk about why that's not necessarily the greatest idea. And then you may want to get an upkeep, a further upkeep for Nurgle units. Keep in mind, these only buff, like everything you see here in terms of like an army buff, only buffs his army. If we were talking about faction-wide buffs, that would be a completely different discussion. Like if we had a minus 15% upkeep for Nurgle units, he still would be bad. But if we could get like a substantial upkeep for like Nurgle, like 10-20% upkeep faction-wide for Nurgle, Khorne, etc., that would be great. But you don't have faction-wide benefits except the diplomacy benefit, which can actually be substantial because you can get 30, and then you can get 15 diplomatic relations with all factions if you go with Siege. Probably should be Sinnelleos, to be honest, but like, yeah, it is a mess. You don't have a special skill line. That's one of the problems. So you don't have like some really powerful faction effects except the diplomacy benefit. And even then, when we're thinking about the diplomacy benefit, it's like, oh yeah, great, I can have better diplomatic relations with a bunch of demonic and Warriors of Chaos factions that, sure, I can ally, but I'd be friends with them anyway because we're going to be fighting the same foes. It's not as great of a benefit as you think. And because you're missing quest items, here's the crucial thing. Because you're missing quest items, you're missing those events where when you get the quest item for every other legendary lord, you get a significant amount of gold early on. So 5,000 gold for the event. If it's quest battle, it can be even 10,000 for the post-battle loot, and a temporary amount of replenishment. You do not have that luxury. And this is just the issues with the Daemon Prince as a character, let alone the issues that we start talking in terms of factions. So you don't have a research tree. You can't improve your units faction-wide. which is a significant issue. I mean, there are certainly some benefits that you can get over here from this particular tree, because the demonic glory tree is supposed to be a research tree, but a lot of the benefits don't hold a candle to a research tree, and because they're a linear progression, you don't get to choose on focusing on things that are important. And on top of that, this locks off, you're one of the few factions, actually I think you're the only faction really, that has units locked off based on research, quote unquote research, demonic glory. So, oh, you want to get blood udders, you need to get corn glory. You want to get rot flies, or you want to get exalted plague bearers of Nurgle, or a lot of these good units, and your hero capacity. You're going to, or not hero capacity, hero recruitment, you're going to need to get demonic glory. It is really frustrating to have to tackle. And again, the benefits are not necessarily as good as what you might get for a researcher, because there's a lot of fluff over here. Like, there's so many different items that kind of fill the same role really in a campaign. They're just not really worth it. There are some solid benefits, but there's also a lot of useless trash over here. So you don't have a research tree, you can't equip regular items on him, you don't have a special skill line like every other Legendary Lord in the game, well, except Manfred. What do you have? That's the thing. Well, a really crappy economy and a lot of issues in terms of empire building. So when you take over a settlement, and just to understand how bad the Daemon Prince is, every other Legendary Lord that starts with no settlement, they don't have attrition when they don't have a settlement. Just to note that. The Daemon Prince actually has attrition when he doesn't control a settlement. That's how lazy, if you will, Creative Assembly was with his design. But here's the thing. When it comes to control, your control is determined by Chaos Undivided Corruption. Okay, all well and good, you are undivided. The problem is, every settlement, you start in the tumor over here, and it's a Nurgle province. It has a lot of Nurgle corruption. And your structures, the main way you get undivided corruption is through the main settlement structures. But the thing is, when you take over a settlement as the Daemon Prince, you have to dedicate it to a particular god, which is going to generate corruption for that god. So over here, even if I wanted to build up a lot of Chaos Undivided Corruption, it would be a lot of effort and it really wouldn't work. Yes, I could enable the commandment to foster cults. There are ways of doing it, but it's a lot of hassle and not really worth it. But that means that I'm constantly at risk of rebellion over here. That's the first issue. If you're dealing with the systems, like you have to dedicate settlements to a particular god to get glory, and that's the only way to take over settlements, but you're kind of screwing yourself over, because yes, you do get a lot of these individual benefits like growth for Nurgle, all that kind of good stuff. Like if we look over here where... actually, there's not even more diversity. That's another problem to talk about. Because while you can certainly dedicate settlements to a particular god, actually building up the corruption for that particular god is going to be something of an issue. Like over here, I've just taken over the Goromandi Mountains. I've got 0 corruption for any of the other gods. It is a bit of a problem. And you do have a bunch of commandments, but they give you glory. The only corruption you can get is Chaos Undivided Corruption. Kind of a bit of an issue when you think about it. I think it would be a great system if what Creative Assembly did is like, okay, if you say put the provincial capital, let's go with that, that could work. If the provincial capital is, say, Nurgle, as here, then the corruption you're using for control is Nurgle corruption, and the commandment is also going to generate Nurgle corruption. It would be a far better system than the mess you have right now. To understand how bad this is, the Daemon Prince, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think the Daemon Prince is the only Legendary Lord, absolute only Legendary Lord in the entire game that actually has issues with corruption. Sigvald used to have issues with corruption because he was generating Slaaneshi corruption for his settlement buildings. Well, he still generates, sorry. He was generating Slaaneshi corruption, but he was using Chaos Undivided corruption. They did fix his corruption issue, but right now the Daemon Prince is the only one who has a corruption issue in his main element, because it does create a lot of problems. Chaos in particular is reliant heavily on corruption in order to maintain control of their settlements. I've already had a rebellion here, but I've mostly held it in check for the most part. But it is absolutely a problem to tackle in a campaign. I think the way they handle corruption with the Daemon Prince could be improved. But corruption actually is going to be the least of your issues. Your economy is awful. You can't trade. Like, Nakari may have an awful economy, but Nakari can at least trade. Scarbrand may have an awful economy, but in fact the worst economy, but you get a mountain of money from sacking settlements. It does end up working. Siege and Kugaf, yeah, they flat out don't work in a lot of ways. You're worse than they are, however, in a lot of significant ways. You only have one main income building, and it only goes up to 400. To give you an idea, and just keep in mind, this costs a lot of money. To give you an idea, it starts at 100, goes to 200, 300. Greenskins can get a structure that generates 500 at tier 2. And they can't trade. Like, that's the thing. If a faction can trade like the Greenskins, then they have other ways of making up for it. You don't have a way for them to make it up to make up for it. That is the problem. You do have the ability of getting a secondary income building that can generate more income, but it's also going to be really expensive, and it's going to rely on some condition being met. Like, for instance, over here, I made this entire province Nurgle. In this case, I need to get 200 growth in the entire province, or to get 5 development points to get 200 income over there. And it can go all the way to 300. Suffice it to say, even if I was able to meet the condition, it is still pathetic. Sunlight relies on control. Corn is a bit weird. Corn is actually really annoying because you need to have an enemy lord presence in the province in order to generate that corruption. Yeah, that's not really going to happen. It's not reliable at all. And Siege just needs to have Winds of Magic Tempestuous in the province in order to get that extra income. So you can earn a lot of you can earn some extra income, but you're heavily reliant on meeting those conditions, and your income structures are very expensive. Your structures in general are far more expensive than other factions. And here's the thing: the units you have are a lot of them pretty damn expensive to recruit. It's not like we're talking here cheap units. It's the problem that demonic factions have. A lot of their units can be actually pretty damn expensive to maintain. Like a basic Marauder of Khorne does require 125 upkeep. A Blooder is 174. So you won't be able to maintain a lot of armies. In fact, right now it is turn 35 and I'm only generating 10,000 income. With all of this territory that I have under my control. This is no small amount of territory. Other factions might be generating over 20,000 or even more. You generate very little, and you pay a lot for structures. A lot of other factions have much cheaper structures and cheaper units to maintain. It's not just the raw money you're generating, it's also how much money you're having to spend in the course of your campaign. So because of your limited economy, you have fewer units. But let's talk about those units. First off, if you're going to try and play the Daemon Prince without the Champions of Chaos DLC, you're screwed in a lot of ways. Because you won't have a lot of the units that you need in order to work. Oh, you want Marauders and Nurgle? Specifically, early on in a campaign. Not later on. Later on you actually can be fine, but early on you're screwed without the DLC because you don't really have great units to recruit early on from a settlement. In fact, you have basically nothing to recruit. Like, oh, you can recruit like Chaos Warhounds and Chaos Furies. But let's say I don't have the Champions of Chaos. Well, all I could recruit from Nurgle settlement is Marauders of Nurgle. Well, not Marauders of Nurgle, is Nurglings and Chaos Furies, both of which are absolutely terrible units. If I go for Khorne, all I can do is Chaos Warhounds, not great units, and Chaos Furies. If I go with Siege, I can only get blue horrors if I don't get the Champions of Chaos DLC. The Champions of Chaos DLC adds the Marauder unit types, but it's kind of weird because you only get like one type as opposed to all the types. So it just ends up being really weird. And later on, you're not even taking advantage of that situation. Like, if you look at the dedicated demonic factions, like, they get the Chaos Lords, they get all of those units. You have a limited unit selection from the from Chaos because you have only the baseline units that they had at the beginning of the game, and the baseline heroes and lore choices, by the way. The only thing they added from the DLC was the Marauders, so critically important early on, because otherwise you're just down to blue horrors and nurglings or crappy Slaaneshi Marauders. I enjoyed playing a campaign with that, but later on you actually don't even benefit that much as opposed to the other demonic factions who can benefit from the lore choices, hero choices, and the entire unit roster, like Chosen of Tzeentch, you know, full on going there. But if you're for instance playing the Daemon Prince, you only have the baseline unit, so you can only get like Chaos Warriors of Nurgle with great weapons. Do you get Chosen of Nurgle, which would actually be pretty powerful? No, get screwed, more or less. That's what the game is telling you. That's how little effort they put in with the Daemon Prince. This is how bad he is. So your units are really expensive, and you have a pretty bad unit roster, actually. Like, you can make it work with Marauders of Nurgle. I have made it work, but I gotta tell you, this campaign has been an experience of pain and suffering. The only things that make it that this faction has an advantage is, one, the diplomacy benefit you do get, plus 30 with Chaos factions and an additional 15 with other factions. The fact you can vassalize through diplomacy only other factions. So over here, I've managed to vassalize France, so I'm gaining some money. Very little, to be very clear, because his economy is awful given the territory of Kislev. But I've managed to vassalize France, so I'm gaining some money over here. In fact, if not for that money, I would be in a deficit over here. Though granted, I'm kind of trying to emergency recruit here because Be'lakor is coming. Different discussion, though it's probably just a wise idea to get the hell out of here. Then there's the fact you can recruit all of the regiments of renown. But let's talk about this. While you do have a lot of power through these regiments of renown from all the Chaos factions, like all the gods, all the units, while this is certainly a lot of power, guess who also can do that? Be'lakor, Archaon, Sigvald, Kolic can also do that. So the power that you have there is not unique to you. What is, however, interesting is you do have the potential, some late game potential, if you're willing to endure the miserable early game, if you're willing to endure a campaign that's going to be pretty freaking terrible for like 40 turns or so, or 30 turns, you actually do have the ability to potentially end up steamrolling in the late game. But how? Well, you have one thing that can kind of make it work, kind of. So you can get a bunch of growth and a significant upkeep benefit and casualty replenishment benefit because you can get bloodletting. It is the exact same bloodletting that Skarbrand has, and it is incredibly powerful for Skarbrand because it gives you a lot of growth and an upkeep benefit. For like, the upkeep benefit is for the army only, but the growth is for every single army. So if you build up a lot of armies with high bloodletting, then one, they'll be cheaper, though keep in mind they're still going to be pretty expensive. Even if I got the minus 20% upkeep over here, it still would be over, what, 2.5k to maintain this army. And this army is a fairly basic army that I have here. Like over here, like I would be looking at what, 3k or close to 3k in order to maintain this army. Sure, the regiments in renown I could get rid of and significantly reduce upkeep, but it's only really the regiments in renown that kept me going in this campaign and have allowed me to conquer this territory. Because if I had to just recruit units and rely on them to win battles, I would not have won squat. But of course, I haven't kept the regiments around because I've been dealing with various trouble spots, like eliminating Trog, did that with a couple of regiments in renown, and now I'm dealing with the Chaos Dwarves. And then Be'lakor is going to show up and ruin my days, because that's just how it's going to go. Shouldn't have allied Wulfric. But it's the combination of a weak economy, limited army roster, that just doesn't end up working. Oh, and then let's talk about the heroes. The heroes can be good, but you do actually have a problem with that as well. Increasing capacity. So in unlocking the heroes is done for glory, that's easy enough. Increasing capacity requires you to get these structures to tier 3. Now you do have the potential of getting a lot of heroes because you can increase the capacity with every minor or major settlement you do have. But you kind of need to screw over your empire in order to manage it, because you need to dedicate them to particular gods. Like if you want Nurgle heroes, like if you want to get a bunch of casualty replenishment, then you need the Plague Ridden, which requires you to get the Nurgle settlement. And you can't change these settlements around either. I mean, I guess you could abandon it, take it over, but yeah, that's a huge hassle. If you want campaign movement range, then you need Blood Reapers. I mean, I guess you could just limit yourself to Khorne and Nurgle, and that could actually end up working if you so desire. And just get a bunch of Blood Reapers and Plague Ridden, but you may want some decent magics over Iridescent Horrors. You may be able to deal without the Allurus, but she's also a caster, so there's... And in general, like, having a lot of heroes might actually be the best possible option for you, because they will be better than a lot of the crappy units you're going to be forced to recruit, because you can't afford any of the good units. This is the problem with having expensive units with a weak economy. It creates a lot of issues, especially in this area where you start. See, the problem with the Chaos Wastes, and this is kind of ridiculous, the Demon Prince starts in a Chaos Waste. Most legendary lords that start in the Chaos Waste have a very easy time. Not the Demon Prince, because he actually needs a lot of territory. But the problem is that in the Chaos Waste 1, it's actually more vulnerable to attack from other factions, though let's say Chaos factions don't attack you. You start near Malice Darkblade. Enjoy trying to deal with him early on in a campaign. He is far more powerful than you. In fact, he might be able to solo your entire early game army if you end up in a war with him. That is what you have to deal with early on in a campaign, potentially. Let alone Kislev, the potential of getting involved in many wars between the various Chaos factions, and so on and so forth. Lots of issues around to tackle. Questine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.